Picture the world stage in the closing years of the 1800s. Britain stood unchallenged, an imperial colossus draped across every continent. Its crimson banner flew from the harbors of Asia to the diamond fields of southern Africa, from the frozen Canadian territories to the sprawling ranches of the Australian outback. Queen Victoria's realm embodied a truth spoken with confidence. Daylight perpetually graced some corner of her domain. The Royal Navy commanded the seas with authority, unseen since Napoleon's defeat. London served as more than a mere capital. It functioned as the nerve center of global commerce, the clearinghouse where international transactions were settled, where financial destinies were determined. The Victorian elite, settled comfortably in their exclusive London establishments, perceived order as their birthright. Hierarchy seemed natural. British supremacy appeared permanent. Yet across the vast Atlantic, a fundamentally different force was gathering momentum. European aristocracies regarded the United States with complicated feelings. Dismissiveness mixed with growing anxiety. Throughout most of the 19th century, Americans appeared as rough, edged relations noisy, culturally unsophisticated, preoccupied with conquering their own wilderness. By the mid-1890s, however, the western frontier had vanished. The relentless energy that propelled settlers across endless plains now sought external outlets. A transformation had occurred beneath the surface. While Britain managed far-flung colonial territories, America constructed industrial capacity. American steel mills outproduced British foundries. American railway lines exceeded all other nations combined. Immigration waves delivered endless labor supplies. The nation resembled a compressed spring of industrial might, waiting for release. The economic panic of 1893 left Americans bitter and restless. Nationalist sentiment surged. A conviction spread that America had matured and deserved recognition among elite global powers. Two geological forces were on collision course: Britain's overstretched empire entering decline, and America's aggressive republic ascending. The collision point would surprise everyone, not a strategic choke point like Suez or Gibraltar, but a mosquito-plagued jungle patch on South America's northern shoulder, barely marked on contemporary maps. The quarrel between Venezuela and Britain exemplified colonial headaches that dragged on until origins blurred. It traced back to Britain's acquisition of British Guyana from Dutch control during the Napoleonic era. The Dutch had never bothered defining their colony's western boundary. The Orinoco Basin's dense rainforests held no interest. Swamps, predators, impenetrable vegetation, zero economic value, but imperial powers despise undefined borders. In 1841, Britain dispatched German naturalist Robert Schomburgk to survey the colony. Schomburgk drew a boundary line destined for infamy. His line pushed British claims dramatically westward, encompassing the Orinoco River's mouth. Venezuela's commercial lifeline. Venezuelan protests fell on deaf ears. Venezuela was weak, unstable, plagued by internal conflicts. Britain commanded the globe. The dispute simmered across 5 decades, a minor diplomatic irritation. Then prospectors struck gold. Late 19th century discoveries revealed massive alluvial deposits in the Cuyuni River region, directly within disputed territory. The worthless jungle suddenly promised fortunes. Gold fever ignited. British miners and settlers flooded the zone. The British government formalized claims along the Schomburgk line, then seized an additional 33,000 square miles. For Venezuela, this threatened survival. Britain wasn't claiming jungle. They were seizing control of the Orinoco Delta, positioning themselves to strangle Venezuelan commerce. Desperate, Venezuela severed diplomatic ties in 1887. Appeals to European powers proved futile. Nobody challenged London. Venezuela held one remaining card: dragged the United States into the conflict. Venezuela hired former American ambassador William Scruggs as their advocate. Scruggs mastered propaganda arts. He authored a pamphlet, British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine on Trial. He distributed copies to every congressman, senator, and newspaper editor in Washington. His argument was elegant and inflammatory. Britain was violating America's sacred foreign policy principle, the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe's 1823 declaration stated that American continents would no longer accept European colonization. For 70 years, this remained largely theoretical. The U.S. Navy couldn't enforce it against the Royal Navy. But Scruggs' pamphlet landed in Washington precisely when America sought confrontation. President Grover Cleveland faced political siege. The economy was collapsing. Strikes and riots convulsed the nation. Republicans accused him of foreign policy weakness. Cleveland needed victory. His Secretary of State, Richard Olney, was a Boston corporate attorney with bulldog temperament and deep faith in American exceptionalism. Examining the South American map, Olney saw not a border dispute but a test. If Britain could redraw Venezuela's boundaries at will, the Monroe Doctrine meant nothing. Summer 1895, Olney crafted a diplomatic note to Britain that would become legendary for its aggression. Olney didn't merely request arbitration. He delivered a lecture. He wrote that the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law. A stunning power assertion. Olney informed the British Empire that within the Western Hemisphere, American authority was supreme. He characterized British refusal to arbitrate as aggression violating the Monroe Doctrine. He demanded response. The note reached London in July 1895, landing on Prime Minister Lord Salisbury's desk. Salisbury embodied an earlier era. A bearded aristocratic figure, he conducted diplomacy with wary cynicism born from experience. He viewed Americans as culturally inferior upstarts. He read Olney's note with amused irritation, dismissing its arguments as legal nonsense. The Monroe Doctrine, he correctly noted, lacked international law status. Salisbury committed a catastrophic error. He ignored the note. He let it sit. He vacationed. He attended to African and Near Eastern matters. He assumed Americans were posturing for domestic consumption. 4 months passed. London's silence was deafening. To Cleveland and Olney, this delay represented calculated insult, British aristocracy condescending to the American Republic. Finally, late November brought the British reply. 2 separate notes methodically dismantling Olney's arguments. Salisbury lectured Americans on history and law. He flatly stated the Monroe Doctrine didn't apply to boundary disputes. He refused arbitration. He refused to budge on the Schomburg line. The tone was courteous, but the message was absolute. Mind your own business. When President Cleveland read Salisbury's reply, fury consumed him. He felt personally disrespected. The British hadn't just refused. They had treated the United States like a child requiring education. Cleveland decided to escalate. He decided to remove the issue from quiet diplomatic corridors and throw it into the public arena. He decided to threaten war. December 17, 1895, Grover Cleveland sent a special message to Congress. The text hit Washington like a thunderclap. Cleveland requested congressional funding to create an American commission investigating the border dispute. But then came the explosive part. Cleveland declared that once this commission determined the true border, it would be America's duty to resist by every means in its power any British appropriation of Venezuelan territory. Resist by every means. In diplomatic language, that means war. The reaction in the United States was instantaneous and explosive. The congressional chamber erupted in cheers. Republicans and Democrats united overnight against the old enemy. The press went wild. Headlines screamed war declarations. The Civil War generation felt a surge of vengeful patriotism. The Irish American community was ecstatic at the prospect of fighting Britain. Across major cities, Crowds gathered to sing patriotic songs. Militia regiments began drilling. War fever swept the land, fueled by decades of pent-up industrial energy and national pride. In London, news of Cleveland's message arrived with the morning papers on December 18th. The British public was bewildered. They had been paying almost no attention to the Venezuela issue. Suddenly, they opened their newspapers to find that the American president was threatening war. The initial British reaction was shock and disbelief. But as reports from Washington began arriving, the gravity became clear. The Americans were deadly serious. Lord Salisbury met with his cabinet. The mood was grim. They examined the strategic situation and realized they were trapped. They had underestimated the Americans. As the admirals began calculating, the reality of war with the United States began to look terrifying. Yes, the Royal Navy was larger, but its ships were scattered globally. To fight the Americans, they would need to concentrate the fleet in the Atlantic, leaving the empire exposed in Asia and the Mediterranean. And the Americans had advantages no other enemy possessed. They were uninvadable. The British Army was tiny compared to potential American manpower. Canada was essentially a hostage with a thousands-mile-long border impossible to defend. If war broke out, American troops would march into Montreal and Toronto within weeks. Furthermore, the Americans had terrifying industrial capacity. They could build warships faster than British shipyards. A war with America would not be a quick colonial skirmish. It would be grinding total war against a continent-sized nation with limitless resources. But the most immediate threat wasn't military. It was financial. On Wall Street, the threat of war caused panic. The stock market crashed. British investors holding billions in American railway stocks rushed to sell. The liquidity of the London market evaporated. The City of London sent a clear message to the government: a war with our biggest trading partner will bankrupt us. The British elite found themselves staring into the abyss. They were isolated. In Europe, the German Kaiser was growing increasingly belligerent. In Africa, the Boers were arming themselves. In the Far East, Russia and Japan were rising. Britain had no allies. Splendid isolation now looked dangerous. As Christmas 1895 approached, the world held its breath. Newspapers filled with talk of ironclads and invasion routes. Telegraph cables hummed with coded messages. The British lion was crouching. The American eagle was screaming. And for the first time in 100 years, it wasn't clear who would blink first. But history often turns on coincidences. Just as tension over Venezuela reached its boiling point, an unrelated event on the other side of the world provided the distraction that saved the peace. January 2, 1896. News reached London of a disaster in South Africa. British colonial administrator Leander Starr Jameson had led a botched illegal raid into the independent Boer Republic. The raiders were captured and humiliated. German Kaiser Wilhelm II sent a telegram to Boer President Paul Kruger congratulating him on repelling British invaders. The Kruger telegram was a bombshell. It was a direct diplomatic insult to Great Britain. It implied that Germany was willing to support the Boers militarily. The British public suddenly spun around in fury. The anger toward Washington evaporated and was replaced by burning hatred for Berlin. For Lord Salisbury, this was a gift from the heavens. The German threat was real and dangerous. The American threat in Venezuela was, by comparison, manageable. The Kaiser had inadvertently clarified Britain's strategic priorities. Britain could not afford to be enemies with Germany and America simultaneously. Salisbury seized the opportunity to de-escalate with the United States. He used the German threat as cover to back down without appearing weak. February 1896. The British government agreed to the primary American demand. They would submit the Venezuela border dispute to neutral arbitration. This was the blink. After months of declaring they would never submit, they submitted. They accepted the premise that the United States had the right to intervene. To save face, British diplomats insisted on technical conditions about British settlers. The Americans agreed. It was a fig leaf to cover the British retreat, but everyone knew what had happened. The Monroe Doctrine had been enforced at gunpoint. The arbitration panel that met in Paris in 1899 delivered an ironic verdict. The tribunal awarded Britain nearly 90% of the disputed territory. The Schomburg Line was largely upheld. The gold mine stayed in British hands. Britain got the land, but the United States got the hemisphere. The specific location of the border didn't matter. What mattered was the precedent. Britain had acknowledged that it could no longer act unilaterally in the Americas. Washington was now the Supreme Court of the Western Hemisphere. This marked the beginning of a profound shift in British strategy known as the Great Rapprochement. The British ruling class, deeply shaken by the crisis, engaged in a ruthless assessment of their global position. They examined the rising power of Germany, the expansion of Russia, and the industrial explosion of the United States. They realized the Victorian era of effortless dominance was over. They decided that the United States was the one power they could not defeat and therefore must befriend. If you can't beat them, join them. This wasn't sentiment based on shared language or culture. It was cold, hard realpolitik. The British realized that American industrial strength was becoming the fulcrum of the world economy. Securing American friendship was the best insurance policy for British Empire survival elsewhere. So began a systematic campaign of appeasement. Over the next decade, Britain quietly liquidated its strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere, handing them over to the United States one by one. The first sacrifice was the Panama Canal. In 1901, the United States demanded a new deal. They wanted to build the canal themselves, own it, and fortify it. In the past, Britain would have refused, but now the British simply folded. They signed the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, giving the United States exclusive rights to build and control the Panama Canal. Britain asked for nothing in return. They simply gave away the most strategic waterway of the 20th century. It was an admission that the Caribbean was now an American lake. Then came military withdrawal. For 2 centuries, the Royal Navy's North America Squadron had been the symbol of British power in the Americas. In the early 20th century, First Sea Lord Admiral Fisher made a radical decision. He recalled the squadron. He brought the battleships back to home waters to face the German threat. British bases in the Caribbean were hollowed out. Britain essentially demilitarized its frontier with the United States. This withdrawal created a power vacuum that the United States filled immediately. In 1898, just 3 years after the Venezuela crisis, the United States launched the Spanish-American War. They kicked Spain out of Cuba and seized Puerto Rico. And what did Britain do? Britain was the only European power that supported the United States. While France and Germany sympathized with Spain, Britain encouraged the Americans. The British press cheered the U.S. victory. British diplomats kept other European powers from intervening. It was the dawn of a new partnership. Britain was outsourcing Western Hemisphere security to Washington. This dynamic was tested again in 1902 during the Venezuela debt crisis. Venezuelan dictator Cipriano Castro refused to pay debts to European bankers. Britain, Germany, and Italy blockaded the Venezuelan coast. President Theodore Roosevelt watched with deep suspicion. He formulated the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, stating that the United States would act as an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. He quietly warned the Germans and British to back off. The British reaction was telling. Instead of arguing, they immediately pulled their ships back. They deferred to Roosevelt. British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour publicly stated that Britain would be happy to see the United States take on the role of policeman. It was a complete reversal of the 1895 position. In 7 years, Britain had gone from threatening war over a borderline to inviting the Americans to run the continent. The consequences of this great rapprochement defined the 20th century. By avoiding war in 1895 and cultivating partnership, Britain secured the ultimate ally. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain was financially exhausted within 2 years. It was American loans and American industry that kept Britain fighting. If the Venezuela crisis had gone differently, if the two nations had remained enemies, the United States might have stayed neutral or even favored Germany. Instead, the special relationship forged in the humiliation of 1895 saved Britain from annihilation. But it saved Britain as a nation, not as a superpower. The Venezuela crisis was the moment the torch was passed. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a confrontation. The British Empire looked into the eyes of the American Republic and saw its own future. It saw a nation with more steel, more coal, more people, and more money. And it made the rational choice to step aside. The psychological impact on the British ruling class was profound. They began to view themselves less as masters of the world and more as the Greeks to the American Romans. The wiser older culture guiding the brash new power. It was a comforting myth that helped them accept their decline. For Venezuela, the result was a mixed blessing. They had been saved from British expansion, but they had fallen under American hegemony. The U.S. would dominate their politics and their oil industry for the next century. They learned that the Monroe Doctrine was not designed to protect Latin America from imperialism. It was designed to ensure that the only imperialism allowed was American. Today, if you visit the border region between Guyana and Venezuela, the jungle has reclaimed the old mining camps. But the invisible line drawn through those trees represents the fault line of history. It is the place where the 19th century ended and the 20th century began. It is the place where the British lion turned tail. It is the place where the United States learned that it could give orders to the world, and the world would obey. The 1895 crisis is the forgotten prequel to the modern world. It proves that the most significant wars are often the ones never fought. Britain lost the Western Hemisphere without firing a shot, but in doing so, it gained the lifeline that allowed it to survive the storms to come. It was a humiliating climb down, but it was also perhaps the smartest diplomatic move in the history of the British Empire. They lost a continent, but they kept their existence. And in the ruthless game of empires, survival is the only victory that counts. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.